Well, without further ado, I just want to welcome Alister McGrath to Bermuda and to our podium this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here in Bermuda. I brought a present with me from England for you. It's my cold. So, if I have a very husky voice, it's because it's very sore. So I do apologize for that. But I think we'll be able to manage very well. If I had been told when I was a young man that I'd be giving a lecture in Bermuda on science, faith, and religion stuff, I'd been very surprised. A, because I grew up in Northern Ireland, and the height of Northern Ireland's cultural activities is the Donkey Derby. So, coming to Bermuda would really have been very, very exciting. But also, if I would have assumed if I was speaking on science, faith, religion stuff, I would have been presenting the atheist side of the argument. Because when I was younger, it seemed to me very, very simple. Science proves what it believes. Religion is kind of just running away from reality. It's not about evidence. In fact, if anything, it's about the evasion of evidence. And certainly when I was a 16-year-old, I was quite an aggressive atheist. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins these days, I get all nostalgic because that was the way I used to be as a younger man. What I want to do this afternoon is talk a bit about some of the issues that arise from this dialogue between science and faith and just see where they take us. And obviously, I'm going to tell you my own story. I'm sure it raises some interesting questions. But I think the main issue is the themes. And whether you think science is a good thing or a bad thing, religion is a good thing or a bad thing, the relation of science and religion is an interesting and important thing. And I'm hopeful that we'll have a good time this afternoon beginning to open up some of the issues. And of course, it's very difficult not to talk about these issues without being aware of the importance of sciences for the movement that we now call the New Atheism. And that phrase, the New Atheism, it was invented back in 2006 by a journalist who wanted to kind of describe the kind of atheism he saw in the writings of people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, which basically was traditional atheism but kind of turbocharged, appealing in particular to the natural sciences. And I think it's right to engage with Richard Dawkins in particular because he has quite strong views on the relationship of science and religion, and they're very interesting views, and I think you'd expect me to interact with at least some of them during this afternoon, and I certainly intend to do that. What is new about the New Atheism? Those of you who've read Richard Dawkins may well have found yourself every now and then, perhaps every other page, saying, haven't we actually heard this before? And I think that actually that is probably true. There's a sense in which the New Atheism is using arguments that actually are not really new at all. What I think is new is the aggressiveness of which they are stated, but also, of course, the way in which they use what I think are very media-friendly sound bites to express their ideas. For example, God's a delusion, something like that. And that certainly has got a lot more attention for these ideas than I think would otherwise be the case. But I think what I notice in the writings of the New Atheism is the dominant theme of anger. They are angry that religion is here. And I've struggled a little bit to understand why that is. But certainly, I think there are clues here. And I want to mention one in particular, which I think is quite helpful. And that is that in a very interesting set of lectures marking the 30th anniversary of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, these lectures were given in 2006. Ian McEwan, who is quite an anti-religious writer, talked about his expectation as a young man, going back to the early 1960s, that a generation from then, religion would be dead. That in effect, people would no longer believe in God, no longer talk about God, that God would be virtually eradicated from public discourse and private faith. And McEwan said, look, it just has not turned out like that at all. Religion may pay a lower profile in Western Europe than before, but elsewhere it seems to have resurged. And there's this sense of anger that something that everyone had thought, or at least some people have thought, was disappearing, actually seemed to be lingering on, and more than that, actually doing really rather well. I think that's part of the explanation, because maybe the new atheism is trying to say, look, one more go and we'll finally get rid of this. And this may explain the impatience, the anger that we find in some new atheist writings. But that's just by way of introduction. But let me talk about my own move away from atheism. When I was in my teens, studying the sciences at high school, with my gun sights set on studying chemistry at Oxford University, it was very clear to me that science and God were in effect completely incompatible. Science gobbled up the intellectual space once occupied by God. And I could see no reason whatsoever for any scientifically informed person for believing in God. It just seemed to me to be a hangover of an earlier and darker age. It seemed to me to be something that was dying out, something that in effect was simply a cultural hangover that would soon be gone forever. And my view was really very simple. Science proves things. Religion just asserts things and hopes they're true and kind of you cross your fingers and hope for the best. When I won a scholarship to Oxford University, I found I had time on my hands because I won the scholarship in December, the school year starts in October, so I spent the next couple of months, in effect, ransacking the school library, reading up about chemistry and physics and all sort of stuff. And then I came across a section of the library that I hadn't noticed. It was called The History and Philosophy of Science. And as I read the rather meager holdings in the school library, I found myself being overwhelmed by what I read. Because it became very, very clear to me that I had an utterly simplistic view of what science was all about. Now, let me give you some examples. For example, I thought science proves things, end of discussion. As I began to read about the philosophy of science, I began to realize that very often science says, well, there are several possibilities here. It may be this, it may be that. There is some evidence for both of them. It actually isn't as straightforward as that. Very often there are multiple possibilities. I began to realize that science is on a journey. And as it navigates its way along, it occasionally takes wrong turns. And of course, it corrects these later. But at the time, people are not aware that these are wrong turns. And I began to realize that very often we are faced with a very difficult situation, which is that we are at this moment in time, this is what science thinks at this moment in time, but in 10 years' time, things may have moved on. And we don't necessarily know in what direction they are going to go. And I began to realize what technically we call the provisionality of scientific theorizing. This is the way we see it at the moment. We have good reasons for thinking this, but of course in the future there may be new evidence, there may be theoretical advances, and we might see things in a very different way then. And I found that quite unsettling. I read Karl Popper's very interesting book, Personal Knowledge. Some of you will have read it. And Popper in that book makes Michael Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge. Michael Polanyi, a chemist who became philosopher. And in that book he says, look, scientists believe lots of theories at the moment, and they know that some of those will turn out to be wrong. The difficulty is knowing which is which. And that unsettled me a lot, I had to say. It didn't bring me to believe in God or anything like that, but it did make me realize that science was much more complicated than I had initially realized. One of the things I think that really began to move me away from my rather dogmatic atheism was my realization that actually atheism was a belief system. I just assumed it was self-evidently true, that was objective fact. In fact, I began to realize it was simply a way of thinking which could be harmonized with the evidence, but which was not demanded by the evidence. And certainly in my debates with atheists, I very often find myself saying something like this. Well, I'm a Christian, I believe in God. You're an atheist, you believe there is no God. We both take our positions as a matter of faith. We can neither of us prove our positions, though we have reason for thinking that we are both right. And really one of the big questions in philosophy these days is how people are able to hold quite different positions, yet at the same time being able to produce reasons for doing so. For those of you who are philosophers, the issue is not proof, but justification of theories. And I'll come back to that later. So I want to begin now to engage with some of the questions that we're opening up. I want to begin by making it absolutely clear that I still love the natural sciences. Indeed, what I think made me want to study sciences at university was my sense of deep fascination with the natural world. And it seemed to me then, and still seems to me, that the natural sciences gave us a wonderful way of exploring the world around us. And I can still remember building a little telescope when I was about 10 so I could look at the planets and the moon in much greater detail. And so this sense of a love of nature has never gone away. What I think has happened is a growing realization that things that I once thought were admirably simple were not so at all. And I do want to emphasize that the scientific method is very, very powerful. But I also want to suggest to you it has its limits. If you're using a tool, one of the very first things you're going to do is to calibrate that tool, to figure out when it works, when it doesn't work, when it's at its most reliable, the bits when, in effect, you don't want to trust it too much. And that's true of science as much as anything. And for me, science is wonderful in many domains, but not necessarily in all. And certainly Richard Dawkins and I disagree on many things, but there's one thing he said which I think is absolutely right, and that is that science has no means for telling us what is ethical. That's from his book, A Devil's Chaplain, published in 2003. And it seems to me Dawkins really is quite right at that point. And it does, I think, raise some very interesting questions. And the question I want to raise with you at this stage, which I'll follow through on later in this lecture, is this. If science cannot tell us what is right, what is good, does that mean that we say, well, in that case, there is no point in trying to lead the good life. Let's just do what we want. Or do we say, well, science is very good in its own sphere of competency, but maybe there are areas where actually it can't help us, like what is good. And in those areas, we look for something else to help us out. And in many ways, the vision I'm laying before you this afternoon is that reality is complex, and that science has a major role to play in our engagement with this rich and wonderful world that we have around us, and indeed with our own understanding of ourselves and that world. But science is not able to answer all our questions, even though they are good questions. And therefore, the approach I'm going to introduce to you is simply maybe we need science and faith as a way of helping us deal with the richness of the world we see around us. So let's begin to look at some of the issues. I'm going to interact with Richard Dawkins because I think he is very well known, and actually he writes very, very well, and he is a superb representative of the view that science has eliminated faith in God. Let's begin to look at some of the things he says. The first point that Richard Dawkins makes is this, that science has an explanatory capacity which transcends that of any other discipline, and therefore other people simply assert things to be right, whereas science is able to give good reasons for saying this is why we think they're right. Now, I want to agree with them up to a point. I want to emphasize that science is very, very good, that in certain areas I think it is unparalleled. But nevertheless, I want to suggest that the picture is actually rather more complex than that suggests. I want to make it clear that the scientific method as such is simply incapable of adjudicating the God question. And you may know that that issue was a cause of major controversy between Richard Dawkins and some other biologists who felt that he basically was overstating things considerably. I think it is a fair point to make. Let me try and explain this. I'm a Christian, and I'm not saying science proves Christianity. I could never say that. But what I can say is that it's very easy to harmonize science with Christianity, to look at science, to look at the scientific method through Christian eyes and say, look, the Christian faith talks about an ordered world, that God makes the world with a certain organized framework, and that we can uncover and represent this framework through the scientific endeavor. So I'm not saying science proves Christianity. I'm just saying that science is very easy to accommodate within a Christian worldview. Now, my atheist friends would say something like this. Science is very easy to accommodate within an atheist way of thinking. And they would give certain reasons, which I would take with great seriousness. But at the end of the day, when our discussions are done, it's not that science proves atheism. It's just that science is open to both atheist and agnostic and Christian and lots of other things as well, interpretations. And here's the point I want to suggest. Science in itself and of itself is neither theistic or atheistic. It's just science. The issue is, how do we read science from the perspective of a position, whether it's Christianity or atheism? Now, Richard Dawkins argues like this. The difference between an atheist and a person who believes in God is only one item, and that's God. Therefore, the atheist way of looking at things is simpler because it has one less item on its inventory. Now, I want to take that seriously. I think that is a fair point, although actually the inventory is so big that maybe one item wouldn't make a huge difference. But here's my point. If Christianity is right, then God is not simply an item on inventory. God gives us a way of looking at things which actually is explanatory in itself. And therefore, we can remove quite a lot of items from the inventory because belief in the Christian vision of God actually ends up to be so richly explanatory. And I find this theme in the writings of C.S. Lewis, who was no scientist, but as an atheist who turned Christian, discovered this explanatory richness. And he wrote these words once, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So it seems to me there's a very important point that we need to make there. Richard Dawkins suggests at one point in his book, The God Delusion, that in effect God is rather like a teapot orbiting Mars. It's one item in the inventory. If a teapot gets broken or disappears, it makes no difference to us whatsoever. And I'm sure that's true of teapots. But the point I want to make to you is if you're a Christian here this afternoon, you will know that God is actually rather more important than an orbiting teapot. It's actually the ground of our being. It's in a different league altogether. So I think there's a good further discussion to be had, and I don't really think a simplistic removal of God like that is necessarily called for. Let me, if I may, read a little bit to you from Stephen Hawking's very interesting book, The Grand Design. And in this book, Hawking actually inclines towards the view that Richard Dawkins takes. He takes the view that God is made redundant by the laws of physics. I want to take you through his argument and then just make a few comments on it, which I think you'll find interesting. Hawking, in effect, is saying something like this. Because of the laws of physics, there is no need to invoke God at all. The universe explains itself. It functions entirely on its own. And Hawking argues that there is, I quote, no need for God to light the blue touch paper of the cosmic firework. It's a very nice image, I think. He goes on to say that, again I quote, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. So for Hawking, the Big Bang just happened spontaneously, the outcome of the laws of physics, not of some kind of cosmic designer. Now, I think that's a very interesting point, and it might be good just to engage with it a little better. I think the first point to make is that my scientific colleagues, both back in Oxford and also in London, are actually rather surprised by Hawking's assertions in that book. Because in effect, Hawking's approach represents a very speculative interpretation of what is actually already a very speculative theory itself. And I think that there are points at which he does need to be challenged. For example, he argues that the Big Bang was the inevitable consequence of the laws of physics. Again, I quote from him, "Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing." But here's the crucial point. I want you to listen very carefully. Hawking seems to fail to make a distinction between laws and causation, laws and agency. Laws themselves don't create anything. They're just a description of what happens in nature under certain conditions. So, to give an analogy, which I hope will resonate with your local culture, because it does with mine, I want you to imagine you're playing a game of cricket. Newton's laws of motion help us to understand how a player hits a six. But those laws don't cause that to happen. There is actually a human being involved who hits the ball for a six. The laws, Newton's laws, help us to understand what is going on here. But listen very carefully, they don't make it happen. If you don't see the point, then let me ask you to imagine that they are playing cricket in your local sports ground, and the laws of physics are in action, and the players stand there doing nothing. No sixes are hit. The point I'm making is the laws of physics work, they're in action, but we need human agency to make something happen. Once agency happens, the laws of physics describe and govern what happens next, but they don't cause it to happen. Now, Hawking tells us that we don't need to invoke the idea of a creator because the laws of physics are already there. And I know what he means, but I do need to make the point that this simply postpones the issue by one stage. There's no need to invoke God because the laws of physics are there. Well, where did the laws of physics come from? How did gravity come to exist in the first place? What agency, if any, is involved in that? Now, Hawking seems to think it's a question of either the laws of nature or God. But as I've stressed, this doesn't deal with the issue of agency. You might think, for example, of Leonardo da Vinci painting the Mona Lisa. The laws of physics help us understand something of what's going on here, but they hardly compel us to write Leonardo out of the picture, as if he's some unnecessary agent in the process of composition. But I think the problems of Hawking's approach run a lot deeper than this, because a lot of scientists actually are angry with Hawking, particularly the United Kingdom, for, in their view, risking bringing science into disrepute by overstating itself. And this, I think, is a real issue which alarms me as somebody who really loves science, that one of the easiest ways of discrediting something is to overextend it, to make it do things it wasn't meant to do in the first place. And I think many people really worry that, in effect, science's excellent reputation could be compromised by overstatement. There's a sense in which science has gained its excellent reputation by its modesty. It comments only on those things which it can hope to answer, where the evidence leads to certain lines of thought. And scientists know they don't have to comment on everything, just what can be shown to be true by rigorous and testable investigation. And the point I'm making is that the cultural and intellectual authority of science depends critically on its neutrality in these debates. If it's hijacked for ideological purposes, its public reputation can only suffer. Now, this is not a new insight. Many of you will have read the writings of Thomas H. Huxley, Darwin's supporter and advocate in the late 19th century. And Huxley famously wrote these words. Let me read them to you. Science commits suicide when it adopts a creed. I'll read that again. Science commits suicide when it adopts a creed. What's Huxley getting at? It's very simple. Science is a method. It's a way of looking at the world which is constantly getting better and corrects itself as time goes on. Science is not about a body of beliefs, but a method which generates beliefs as it goes along and sometimes corrects those beliefs when they turn out to be wrong. That's a very important point, and I'll come back to this later in this lecture because I want to highlight the massive change in cosmology that's happened in the last 100 years, which illustrates, I think, Huxley's point terribly well. And that's, I think, why many scientists are worried about the way in which science has been adopted by the new atheism. And I think that the feeling is that science is being devalued by simply being used as a weapon against religion. There's a very interesting radio interview in the UK shortly after the appearance of Hawking's books involving Baroness Susan Greenfield, who some of you will know is one of England's most distinguished scientists. And she was asked to comment on Hawking's musings about God. Specifically, she was asked this question. Was she worried about scientists making claims about other areas of life, like religion, but not limited to religion? Yes, I am, she replied. Of course they can make whatever comments they like, but when they assume, rather in a Taliban-like way, that they have all the answers, then I do feel uncomfortable. I think that doesn't necessarily do science a service. And you can see what she's getting at. It's about fixing science, saying, that's the way it is, folks. Buy into it. Whereas, in fact, science is a method which is moving on. You can't freeze it and say, that's the way it is. You can say, that's the way it seems to be at the moment, but it is in the process of moving. Let me read to you again from what Susan Greenfield has to say. And I think actually she makes a very important point here. She writes, all science is provisional, and therefore to claim to have the definitive answer to anything is a hardline view. It would be a very great shame if young people think that to be a scientist, you have to be an atheist. There are plenty of scientists, such as genome researcher Francis Collins, who also have Christian faith. Now, Greenfield there is not saying anything particularly new. Those of you who have read the writings of Stephen Jay Gould will know his emphatic argument, mainly against Richard Dawkins, but also against others, that, again I quote, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm it nor deny it. We simply can't comment on it as scientists. So the issue I'm raising with you really is this. First of all, how important is this theme of the provisionality of science? And secondly, is scientific knowledge limited? By which I mean, are there areas of knowledge, important areas of knowledge, where science actually can't help us arrive at the answer? So those two questions are on the table for further discussion. Now, of course, you can't talk about faith and science without talking about the warfare of science and religion. And many of you will know all about this, particularly if you've read the writings of Richard Dawkins. Science and religion are locked in mortal combat. They always have been, they always will be until science finally wins the day, because in the end it's got to win. And this image of this total warfare between science and religion completely dominates Dawkins' way of thinking. Those of you who've read his book, The God Delusion, I suspect will have got a little bit uncomfortable at one or 2 points. One of them is where he talks about the Neville Chamberlain school of evolutionism. Let me remind you, Neville Chamberlain was the British Prime Minister who talked to Adolf Hitler just before the Second World War. And Richard Dawkins singles out the philosopher Michael Roos at the University of Florida as being a Neville Chamberlain-type person. Why? Because he's an atheist, but he talks to religious people and thinks religion needs to be taken seriously. Now, the point I'm making is that if you're locked into this absolutely deterministic worldview, science, religion, in total warfare, then if scientists talk to religious people, they are traitors. Simple as that. And you can see that that really is a very difficult view to defend. Historically, as you will know, it's indefensible. Recent publications in the history of science have listed the top 10 myths about the history of science. Number one myth is that science and religion are locked in mortal combat. It's not that simple. There have been times where science and religion have been in tension. There have been other times when they are in creative synergy. But you cannot generalize and discern a universal pattern. It's complicated. And that's one of the things I want to emphasize in this lecture. My own feeling is that the public debate is moving on. Certainly in England, the new atheism is fading away. But I want to suggest that the questions they raise remain important. So in the remainder of this lecture, I want to look at some general themes in the relation of science and faith and explore issues with you. And I think you'll find this interesting, and it certainly offers you a way of seeing how science and faith can sit together or work together, though of course I realize some of you will want to adopt a different approach. Let me begin with a point that seems to me to be terribly important. I've talked loosely about science and religion. And some of you will say, well, look, we know what you mean, but you need to, in effect, make a distinction between good science and good religion and bad religion. And I know what you mean. Some of you may have seen Richard Dawkins' television program, The Root of All Evil. If you did, you'll remember the bit towards the beginning where he sits down with some rather weird religious people and gets their views on various things. And by the end of it, I hope I'm not breaking any local libel laws, you get the impression these people were mentally certifiable. You know, they were clearly on a different planet. And the difficulty is that Dawkins, in effect, leaves us with the impression that that is representative of the religious position. What I want to say is this. We need to be careful here. Every movement, religious and scientific, has its mainstream and has its mavericks. And you can easily present a maverick as if they're mainstream. And I just want to say to you, we don't do that. There are lots of religious writers who are sensible about things, and you need to listen to them. And science does have some people who need to be challenged. I'll make this point because I just think it's important to illustrate the point at issue. When I was studying chemistry at Oxford in the 1970s, one of my scientific heroes was Professor Louis Fieser of Harvard University. And his books were great. I read them with great enthusiasm. And of course, I knew he had done various important things during the late 30s and 1940s. For example, the chemical synthesis of vitamin K, which is very important if you've got any problems of blood clotting. He also was able to synthesize hydrocortisone. Lots of good things this man did. But there was also something else he invented at Harvard, which isn't talked about very much. And I suspect some of you know what this is. In 1942, the American military needed a weapon that would take out troop concentrations in the Pacific War theater. And Professor Fieser, who was a very good chemist, very kindly invented the weapon for them. And what he did was he mixed together various byproducts of the oil refining issue with gasoline, petrol, and he created a substance which, once it caught fire, could neither be put out or scraped off the flesh. And it's called napalm. So the point I'm trying to make is, look, you know, we need to be aware there's a darker side to science, a darker side to religion. But here's the all-important point. I know about Fieser now. Does that make me say science is evil? No, not at all. Why should I? Only a mad person would say that. What it does to me is to say, look, we just need to realize scientists are like human beings. They mess up every now and then, and we just need to be a little bit critical to make sure we don't get our way into some kind of idealized situation where scientists can do no wrong. They're like the rest of us. Every now and then, they go wrong. So I think we need to be realistic about this and just say something can go wrong here. But let's move on to something happier. For me, one of the great things about the sciences is that they say to all of us, justify your beliefs. Why do you think that's right and not that? And certainly when I was myself a scientist doing research for my doctorate in molecular biophysics at Oxford University, one of the key skills I had to develop was devising experiments which would let me show which of two possibilities was actually right. I had to have empirical reasons for saying this, not that, seems to be right. And that, I think, is one of the great strengths of science. Its inbuilt tendency to say, don't trust authorities, trust the evidence. And I think I've learned that lesson, and it's a wonderful lesson to learn. And Christians here this afternoon, you need to be aware of that. It's important that you know the reasons for your faith. We live in a very evidence-based culture, and I think that's important. But we need to realize it's not that straightforward. As you've gathered, I'm from Ireland, and Ireland has many good things. It has lots of nice bogs in the west of Ireland. It has some beautiful ocean views when it's not actually raining. There's a very famous saying about Ireland, when you can see the mountains, it's about to rain. If you can't see them, it's because it's raining. I suspect that's probably true of here as well, except you don't have mountains. But one of the points I want to emphasize is this. One of Ireland's greatest contributions to world cultures is the leprechauns. Now, there is a slight problem with leprechauns. Let me just mention a few of them. You can't see them, you can't taste them, you can't touch them, you can't hear them. In fact, there is no bodily sense which would lead you to think there are leprechauns. So if there are any other Irish people in this audience, I'm about to lose you as a friend permanently. I personally think that leprechauns are just nice, but, non-existent. Now, let's go back to the late 1600s. Isaac Newton is thinking about apples falling from trees and planets going around the sun. And he comes up with this brilliant suggestion. If there were a thing called gravity, that would explain all of those things. And as you will know, Newton's laws of motion actually remain with us to this day. They've been modified slightly, but the basic ideas are still there. But there is a problem with gravity. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't see it. In fact, no human sense can actually detect it. But I would want to say it's not in the same category as leprechauns, because in effect, it makes so much sense that the chances are it might be right. With leprechauns, personally, I don't think they actually help us make sense of anything, but that's just my personal view. Now, I'm making this point because you can see immediately that Christians, in effect, would say, look, we don't believe in God because of science, but nevertheless, when we take our belief in God and use it as a lens to look at things, it actually brings things into astonishingly sharp focus. We mentioned the name of Francis Collins a moment ago, and Francis Collins, who used to be an atheist, became a Christian, took the view that his Christian way of looking at things made much more sense of the scientific method and biology than his former atheism. It gave him a lens through which to look at things. Now that proves nothing, but one of the points I want to make to you is this. One way of testing a theory is to say how good is the fit between theory and observation. And I think is a very important point in this conversation. The basic point I want to emphasize is that in real life and in this discussion between science and faith, we need to realize that very often we can provide good reasons for thinking that something is right, but not being able to prove that it is so. Now, let me give you some examples, and I think you'll see the point very, very clearly. I can prove to you that 2 and 2 make 4, and I think all of you would accept that without any worry at all. where does that actually take you? Does it kind of give you a reason to get up in the morning and say, oh, I'm so glad 2 and 2 make 4? You know, I want to make the point it's right, but existentially, it's not significant. Now, it's a very important point, because when you come to the great truths by which we live, in other words, ones that are existentially significant, then we find ourselves in a situation that actually we can't prove any of them. Let me give you some examples. If you read Christopher Hitchens' books, particularly his book, God is Not Great, he says something like this: our belief is no belief. In other words, what he's saying is, I only accept those things that can be proved. But when you read his book, it is littered with moral judgments, very questionable historical judgments, all of which, in effect, he clearly believes to be right. But I can assure you, none of them can be proved to be right. Now, I'm going to make a point which I think many of you will recognize immediately I begin to put it into words, but it's this. Most of us have beliefs which mean a lot to us, which affect the way in which we vote, the way in which we behave. For example, in my own case, I believe very passionately that democracy is better than fascism, and that affects me in a number of ways. Now, suppose you were to say to me, would you mind awfully proving that democracy is better than fascism? I would have to say something like this: I cannot prove it, but I think I can give you some good reasons for thinking this might be right. And I'd invite you each to think about, what you believe to be really, really important. And very often you'll find that it's a moral value, a religious belief, a political belief. These can't be proved. Terry Eagleton, one of Dawkins' biggest critics, says, look, it is obvious to everyone that we hold many beliefs that cannot absolutely be proved, but are nevertheless perfectly reasonable to hold. And that's the way it is. Some of you will have read the writings of Sir Isaiah Berlin. He emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1920s and settled in England and became one of England's best intellectual historians. And he was puzzled by a whole series of things, including the rise of ideologies during the 1930s. And he wrote a number of books in which he argued like this: human beliefs can be organized into 3 categories. Those that can be proved to be true by logic. Well, I think I'd say 2 and 2 make 4 as an example of that. Those that can be proved by science. For example, the chemical formula of water is H2O. And then 3, a category where we can't actually prove these things by logic or by science. And Berlin makes 2 points. Number 1, this 3rd category is huge. Number 2, in that category come all the beliefs by which people actually live. In other words, the moral values, the political beliefs which give life value and purpose, none of which can be proved. For example, I believe rape is wrong. Now, many of you would agree, but if you were to say, look, can you just prove that? I would have difficulty. As those of you who are biologists in the audience will know, a perfectly good Darwinian case can be made for saying that rape might actually lead to the supplementation of the gene pool. The point is, there are lots of shallow truths that we can prove, but the truths by which we live very often lie way beyond that kind of proof. That doesn't make me give up on my beliefs at all. It does make me say, I've got to think about these, I've got to make sure I've got good reasons. But the key thing is good reasons, or philosophically, justification rather than proof. Now, I want to say to you that is not controversial. That's just the way we are as human beings. And the issue really is where we draw the dividing lines. What we decide is reasonable, what we decide is unreasonable, and philosophically, the really interesting question is this: why do 2 sensible people very often take quite opposing views on certain questions when faced with the same evidence? So there are lots of issues there. But let me come to a point that I flagged up earlier. Are there limits to what science can tell us? Now, I personally think there are. I think science is absolutely wonderful in its domains of competency. But then there are other areas where I don't think it works at all well. I've already given you Richard Dawkins' quote. In effect, science has no means for telling us what is ethical. And I think that's right. But let me mention another scientist who in his day was even more distinguished than Richard Dawkins, and that's Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in 1960. And he was a rationalist, didn't believe in God. But he thought a lot about science. And in the year before his death, he published a book called The Limits of Science. And he simply said, look, it's obvious science has limits. There are questions that science cannot answer now, and no conceivable scientific advance would enable it to answer, like, why are we here? What is the point of life? Meadow was just saying that these are absolutely fair questions. They're good questions. Science can't answer them. But that does not mean that they are non-questions, because science can't answer them. Now, I have to say, I'm with Medawar on this one. I think he's absolutely right. To do justice to science, we need to prevent it from straying into areas where it gives bad answers because it's being abused or overextended. Where it's competent, that's absolutely great. But of course, there are a number of questions that arise from this. So let's begin to look at them. Question number 1. I think this is a very important point. Science changes its mind. Let me give you a very interesting example. Suppose this church hall had been here 100 years ago, and we had met together to talk about the latest theories in cosmology. And the speaker would have talked to you about what contemporary scientific theory was all about. As many of you will know, the view was quite simply, the universe has always been here. What we can do, though, is measure it fairly precisely so we understand it better. In the years following the Second World War, that view began to crumble. And we now have this standard cosmological model we sometimes call the Big Bang. Interestingly, Fred Hoyle didn't like this view at all because he thought it, in effect, his views would make everybody start going to church on Sundays because it seemed to him to be very obviously religious. But my point is this. That's a very big turnaround in a century. I'm from England, and back in 1948, there was a very famous debate on Radio 3 between Bertrand Russell, well-known atheist, and and Frederick Copleston, well-known Christian, on the question of God. It was a big debate. It covered areas like, why is the universe here? Can we be moral without God? And so on. Copleston won some of those debates. For example, he was able to argue you cannot be moral without God. But Russell won that first question. Do we need God to explain the universe? No, because the universe has always been here, doesn't require explanation. As many of you will know, there was a replay of that debate in 1998, 50 years later, with William Lane Craig on the Christian side and Anthony Flew on the atheist side. Flew found himself in difficulty about the implications of the standard cosmological model. And in his later years, he became what I think I would loosely describe as a kind of deist, somebody who believed in a God who really was there but didn't do very much. But he certainly moved away from his atheism. So I think I'm trying to say to you, we need to respect the provisionality of scientific theorizing. It changes, it moves on, and we cannot assume that what we have today is the way it's going to stay in the future. Let me now make one more point, which emerges very naturally about some of the issues that we've been talking about. And I'm going to use the phrase levels of explanation. And again, I'm interacting with Richard Dawkins. Dawkins says science explains things, and that makes religious explanations redundant. But that is a very shallow view of scientific explanation. Let me demonstrate what I mean. I'm going to do this. What I'm doing, in case this is an audio recording, is pointing. Okay, I've extended my hand and I'm pointing. Now I'm going to say to you, can you give me an explanation of what has just happened? Now you could give a very, very good physical explanation. You'd say, look, we can track the transmission of these electric impulses which cause muscles to contract. There's a perfectly good scientific explanation about how that hand came to point in that direction. And I would say that's absolutely right, and I have no problems with that, except it's only part of the explanation. And you can see why, because it doesn't tell you that I pointed to draw your attention to what looks like a very exciting notice just over there. You can check out afterwards and see if you agree with me. Now, listen very carefully. Musculoskeletal contractions, wanting to show you a notice. Is it one, or is it the other, or is it both? It's obviously both. My Oxford colleague, John Lennox, who's written on this a lot, he's a professor of mathematics, says, look, imagine that Aunt Jemima has baked a cake, and it's there on the table. And the chemists get to work, they tell you all about its chemical composition. The physicists get to work, they tell you all about how the frosting or the icing is able to stay adhered to the cake, and so on. But they don't tell you Aunt Jemima baked it for your birthday. The model I want to leave you with is very simply this. There's no problem with scientific explanation, but it doesn't tell you the full story. And all of us want to see a big picture, not just a little picture. And that's why, in the end, I think that there is room for a very important dialogue between science and faith. Let me put it very, very simply. Science takes things apart so that we can see how they work. But faith puts them back together again so we can see what they mean. What I want to say to you is that I hope you're like me and say science is great, but also like me and say there are deep questions about life, like meaning, like value, and we need to engage with those as well. And I welcome science in that conversation. But as you can see, there are other partners to that conversation as well. And I think that conversation still has a long way to go, and maybe we'll continue that conversation in the questions which I suspect are about to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.